Okay, everybody, welcome back. This is our final installment here on the story of Watergate or the fall of Richard Nixon. At this point, everybody should have seen the film All the President's Men, and then hopefully all the dots have connected, and you understand the first segment that went all the way up to when the FBI informant, who shall remain unnamed, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about who he really was at the end, but that's kind of foreshadowing. When he reached out to the Washington Post writers and started informing them that, listen, hey, those burglars are not just regular old burglars. It goes all the way to the White House. So today we're going to do the second segment. And it's crazy. Okay, so Richard Nixon wins that election handedly. Um, he beats George McGovern in November of 1972. And in January, he begins serving his second term, having been rightfully reelected again. On this wave of conservative support, he crushed McGovern. It was a complete blowout. I mean, I think Nixon won like 48 out of 50 states or something like that. So he walked into his second term even stronger than his first term, even with, the events that happened, in late 71 with the Watergate break-in, the burglary. Well, his second term, it's not true anymore. It was true for many. Quite often, you say, well, beware the second term curse. Everything starts to fall apart in the second term. Eventually, the burglars are going to be brought to trial. Um, burglary charges are going to be levied on the burglar, and then lo and behold, which happens in the vast majority of cases, um, somebody makes a plea bargain with the prosecution in exchange for bigger fish. And the one that breaks there is James McCord, the former CIA guy, electronics expert. He's the one that cracks and offers the prosecution a bit more information than they were expecting, and he confirms that burglary was actually planned out, and that it was the White House itself that ordered the burglary and the installment of the bugs, and then tried to cover it up by denying that the White House had anything to do with this. So now you understand Nixon's dealing with a Democratic Congress. A Democratic Congress that already, there's even more Democrats in Congress now. Even it's interesting, even though Nixon won by even stronger margin in 72 than he did in 68, Democrats won even more seats in the Senate, and that's kind of crazy. And that should be the norm for years. I mean, the presidency would go to one party, and yet people would give Congress to another party. Um, so this is going to unfold, open up Pandora's box, if you will, once McCord plea bargains and basically and says that there's more to this. And of course, all that confirms um, what the New York Times reporters were writing all along. Um, it doesn't take long before the Senate opens up a series of hearings led by Senator Sam Ervin. The Senate sets up the Senate Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Practices. Now they're going to start looking into creep, where they got their money from, what they spent their money on, which we're going to learn later on. They spent it on the legal defense of those 5 burglars. Another side issue, which the Nixon White House was not supposed to be doing, and of course was a violation of federal law, federal campaign financing law at the time. Um, this Senate committee starts to subpoena White House officials, and over the course of several months, they're going to subpoena over 50 White House officials to answer questions. Well, they're not going to subpoena 50, they're going to subpoena hundreds. Over 50 would eventually face criminal charges. So yes, there's months of testimony given before this committee. And this committee is able to compile quite a lot of information about the inner workings of the Nixon White House. Now, they come to the conclusion that there's only one way to find out the objective, absolute truth of whether these burglaries were orchestrated and ordered from not just the White House, but from Richard Nixon himself. Okay. Oh, and by the way, this is a copy of the indictment. Eventually, the testimony from the subcommittee was picked up by a federal court, D.C., the D.C. District Court, that issues an indictment of everybody in the Nixon inner circle. Mitchell, Haldeman, Heinrichman, Colson, Hardian, Parkinson. These last ones are just minor individuals. What are the charges? Conspiracy, false statements to a government agency, obstruction of justice, perjury, and false declarations. May 17th, 1973. As a result of those indictments, Dean, Haldeman, and Heinrichman all resigned from the White House, from Nixon's staff. And Nixon, in a demonstration of concern, he's trying to feign, well, it's absolutely, horrendous. This is unacceptable. That people, associated with my White House, would do such a thing, So he appoints a special prosecutor to investigate the entire scandal. The White House, it's like an internal investigation. Archibald Cox. Okay. So right there, that's a headline from the Washington Post. And this is towards the end of the Senate hearings. Nixon's trying to cover his tracks, makes it seem that he's just as concerned. 3 top Nixon aides climbed this out. President accepts full responsibility for his men, of course. Richardson will conduct a new probe. Nixon pledges no whitewash on Watergate, and of course he orders Archibald Cox to be a special prosecutor to investigate the Watergate scandal. And apparently, Nixon's going to clean house. He has a bunch of bad actors in the White House, and he's going to get on that job to clean up the White House. That Senate Select Committee is still going on. And towards the end of June, new witnesses are brought to answer questions, and then things start to get really interesting. You remember John Dean actually resigned from the White House, and when he's brought before the Senate hearing, he just goes ahead and admits that, yeah, that Nixon ordered the burglary and he tried to cover it up. Well, that's not good. Okay. It gets better. The following month, they subpoena Federal Aviation Administration Director Alexander Butterfield, who told senators that, yeah. Now here's the thing. Because when Dean brings up and others have brought up, this goes back to what I was about to say. There's only one way to find out the absolute truth, whether Nixon personally ordered this or not. It goes back to Lyndon B. Johnson. Believe it or not, Lyndon B. Johnson came up with the idea that in order to cut down on paperwork, I guess, and I guess to make things easier, he installed a recording system in the Oval Office. See, by law, anything that the president says or does or writes while he is in the White House while he is president, is public record, is property of the White House and by extension the federal government, and therefore can be requested by the federal government. You're a public persona of the highest, public personas, and everything you say and do and write is public. And Lyndon B. Johnson installed this audio recording system to cut down on the paperwork. Listen, if you and I made an agreement and it was on tape, it's recorded, it's archived somewhere, and so we can move on with our lives. We don't have to. Well, Nixon never disinstalled it. Not the right word. Nixon never got rid of it. And now that, and by not getting rid of it, here's the thing. If Nixon did order the burglary and later tried to cover it up, it has to be on tape. It has to be on tape. And if it's on tape and the president said it, well, guess what? The federal government has the right to request it. So somewhere, the proof is out there somewhere, and it's probably been recorded on one of the many audio tapes that are used to record conversations, particularly in the Oval Office, ever since Lyndon B. Johnson. And there is the proof. In July of '73, Mr. Butterfield goes and says, yeah. But what happened in, the Watergate Hotel is not odd. I mean, the White House is littered with microphones. Nixon had, hid microphones all throughout the White House, not just in the Oval Office. Well, if that's true, then, the proof is out there. So both the Senate committee and now Special Prosecutor Cox, Nixon's man, now turns on Nixon and says, listen, put an end to this. We need those recordings. We need those tapes. We need the tapes to either prove or disprove whether you issued that order and its cover up or not. Nixon, of course, refused not only the very legal request of the Senate Select Committee, acting as a constitutional court of law, which it has the right to do so under the Constitution. He refused to comply with the request of the very guy that he set up as a special prosecutor. And now we move from the White House burglary, and did Nixon order it, and did Nixon cover it up, to the evidence. And the evidence must be in one of the thousands of tapes that record conversations in the White House. So, Mr. Nixon, if you supply Senate with those tapes, we will be able to either say yes or no, you were behind it or not, and move on with our lives. And Mr. Nixon is not making things any easier by refusing to hand over those tapes. He begins to tout this argument that, that those tapes are, he has the executive privilege to not have to submit those tapes. So here's an exchange of letters that he had with Senator Ervin. The Select Committee says, Dear Mr. President, today the Select Committee on Presidential Campaign Activities met and unanimously voted that I request that you provide the committee with all the relevant documents and tapes under control of the White House that relate to matters the Select Committee is authorized to investigate under Senate Resolution 60. I refer to the documents mentioned in my letter to Mr. Leonard Garment of June 21st, 1973, in the relevant portion. Sincerely, Sam Ervin, Chairman. Richard Nixon responds, Dear Secretary Schultz, I hereby direct that no officer or agent of the Secret Service shall give testimony to congressional committees concerning matters observed or learned while performing protective functions for the President or in their duties at the White House. This is Nixon telling his people to not comply with a legal order from Senate, digging the ditch even deeper. Which, by the way, folks, compared to the current presidency, this is nothing. And then it happens, the Saturday Night Massacre, October 20th, 1973. Nixon can't do anything about Senate. But he could do something about this Cox guy. He was supposed to be his man, and now Cox is taking the side of the Senate. And there's a rumor that the additional reason why Nixon wanted to get Cox is because Cox had followed the breadcrumbs and discovered that the Nixon White House had handed Bebe Rebozo something in the order of $50,000 to be quiet about what he knew about Nixon's involvement with the burglary and the burglars. Nixon orders his Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, who was insisting that Nixon surrender the tapes. Richardson, instead, stop me if this sounds familiar, and the current White House and the people that have come and gone. Richardson refuses and resigns. Nixon then orders Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus follows the same path as his boss, refuses and resigns. Then Nixon reaches out to Solicitor General Robert Bork. If you don't know who the Solicitor General is, the Solicitor General is the attorney that represents the United States government in any Supreme Court cases in which the United States government is party to. Robert Bork, this is going to cost Robert Bork dearly. Okay, he goes ahead and does what Nixon wants, and then many years later, when Robert Bork, and I believe it was perhaps during the Reagan administration or Bush administration, when Robert Bork is presented as a possible candidate for Supreme Court justice, what he did on October 20th, 1973, pretty much kills his chances. Okay? But he goes ahead and fires Cox. Cox out of the way, Nixon gives the job to Leon Jaworski. He is the new special prosecutor for Watergate. And to Nixon's surprise, what does Jaworski do? Tells President Nixon that he has to turn over the tapes. And eventually Jaworski would file suit against the Nixon administration and take the case to court. So the stars are not aligning for President Nixon. A president's vice president is pretty much their parachute. And things aren't going well for Spiro Agnew. Spiro Agnew was President Nixon's vice president, and Spiro Agnew himself came under federal charges for tax evasion and would end up resigning. Backroom deals are made, and Richard Nixon, the president, could do this. Accepts the resignation of Spiro Agnew and appoints Gerald Ford, not just senator, but president pro tem of the Senate, Gerald Ford, as his new vice president. A deal was made. April 1974, Richard Nixon wanted to give the impression that he is complying with the law. Submits edited not the tapes, but edited transcripts of the tapes as, okay, so this is basically what you wanted, so here's basically what I'm willing to give to you. Special Prosecutor Jaworski refuses to accept these edited transcripts and insists that Nixon surrender the actual unedited. Nixon has reasons, okay, that go beyond the burglary and the cover-up and et cetera, et cetera. He has reasons why he doesn't want to release these tapes, because they are going to be incredibly embarrassing for Richard Nixon. So, be my guest and listen to the content of these tapes, but he is pretty much going to be on tape saying every possible unflattering thing about just about every ethnic group in this country. Okay. Um, this is the stuff that he's really hoping, he's trying to really keep out of the open. Um, and the Nixon White House, as this process continues, it gets emptier and emptier. More and more of his inner circle, these people that I introduced, they're either found guilty, indicted, and sent to. I mean, they're either indicted and found guilty and sent to jail, or they outright resign. Okay, his inner circle, this inner circle that he depended so much on, starts to evaporate. As paranoid as Richard Nixon was, he is starting to look incredibly isolated in his White House. Eventually, it goes to court. This argument that the Nixon White House was making, that the president does not necessarily have to comply with an order from any federal court, claiming that there existed something called executive privilege. The president has certain privileges that are inherent to the presidency itself, which what's the right word I'm looking for, which exempts him from having to comply with the courts like anybody else would. Well, it's not good. There's the Burger Court. This is Burger. He put Burger in there. Not that the Chief Justice alone, dictates the decision of the court. July 24th, 1974, 8-0 ruling. Unanimous consent. The court said that Nixon had no legal right to claim executive privilege. That did not exist. Therefore, he must surrender the tapes. The Constitution says the president, like anybody else, if you are subpoenaed or you are asked to deliver to the court evidence, you must comply with that court order. Nixon refused. And that opened the door for the House of Representatives, that was Democrat majority, to move ahead with what they had wanted to do for some time now, to impeach President Nixon. And you should already know what that means. I mean, because you've lived it in these last couple of years. An impeachment is a two-part process. Impeachment in itself does not remove a president from office. What it does is levy charges against the president, and these charges should fall in line with the constitutional requirement that to be impeached, a president must have committed high crimes and misdemeanors. The founding fathers didn't really give us much gave us perhaps too much interpretive room to determine what that means. 3 charges were brought before the president was accused of. Number 1, obstruction of justice, the very act of issuing and covering up the Watergate break-in. Number 2, abuse of power, using the FBI, CIA, and IRS to go after, intimidate, and harass critics. And this goes all the way back to COINTELPRO as well. 3, most importantly, defying congressional authority, refusing to surrender tapes to that Senate Select Committee. The House voted, and the majority, the supermajority, that's the way an impeachment has to work, voted to go ahead and impeach President Nixon. You should know that the second step is a trial in the Senate. Hoping that, well, I don't know what he was thinking. Hoping that there still existed a chance to salvage the second term of his presidency cognizant of the fact that what's going to come out on those tapes, far beyond the burglary and the cover-up of the burglary, is going to absolutely destroy. Again, we live in different times now, you know, in which the public has either become more desensitized or more accepting of misconduct at the highest levels. He knew that it was going to be pretty damning to his public image, if anything. But he has to comply with the law. And so on August 5th, 1974, after losing the Supreme Court case, he surrenders those tapes to the Senate Select Committee, to the prosecution. I guess his legal team advised him that the proof was there. Already everybody was willing to sing, if you will, in exchange for a plea. And the votes in the Senate, there was enough votes in the Senate to carry out a removal from office. President Nixon is the second president to be impeached after Andrew Johnson, who was impeached over 100 years earlier. Okay, it's going to take a century before another president is impeached. But he was not removed because President Nixon, on August 7th, 1974, decided to resign from the presidency. In a very brief statement, I hereby resign the office of the President of the United States. Making his vice president, Richard Nixon, by default, the new president of the United States. And that's the cover of the New York Times on August 7th. And that is the last we'll see of Richard Nixon in his official capacity as President of the United States, as he boards Marine One with his signature victory sign on each hand, back to Yerba Linda, California. Gerald Ford becomes the only president in American history that the American people did not elect. What does that mean, Mr. Hernandez? It means every person that's occupied the office of the presidency was on the ballot either as a candidate for president of the United States or as the running mate for vice president of the United States. That means if you voted for so-and-so to be president, you also voted for so-and-so to be their vice president. Gerald Ford's name never showed up on anybody's ballot as president or vice president. That's why technically he is the, and it would have gone to the Secretary of State. But Richard Nixon circumvented that process and made this senator his vice president. So when Nixon resigns, Gerald Ford becomes the next president of the United States, the only president never to have been elected. Well, the people of the United States, well, indirectly, the Electoral College, but never to have been elected to the presidency. And he is simply going to finish Nixon's second term. And everybody saw this one coming. This was the deal. 1 month after Gerald Ford took office, in exercise of the powers given to the president by the Constitution, knowing that this is going to destroy Ford's political future beyond that of being the president for those 3 years, Gerald Ford issues Richard Nixon a full and unconditional pardon. And this is going to tear this country apart. Not only is Richard Nixon seen as a man that discredited and soiled the office of the presidency, but it takes it even further by conspiring with Gerald Ford, okay, in an effort to evade justice for any criminal wrongdoing that he might have committed during the White House by being issued a complete. Again, we live in different times. This stuff happens on a daily basis. Nobody cares. But back then, it was an issue. It was a big issue. And that is the conclusion of the Nixon years. And Nixon's, love him or hate him, quite deep fingerprint on this country's history. Next time we speak, we'll speak about the Ford years, the very, I don't know how to describe them. The 70s. Yeah, the, the aftermath of the 60s. I don't know if there's a better way of saying this. But that's okay, so that's it for today. Next time we speak, that's what we'll be speaking about.